If you play this broken piano, you win the prize." The jury laughed, but the poor girl stopped the hall. Emily carried the small, worn-out piano in her arms as she walked through the conservatory's luxurious hallway. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from a mix of anxiety and hope that filled her chest with every step she took toward the stage. The sound of muffled laughter echoed through the hall when she appeared at the entrance. The jury, composed of 3 elegantly dressed people, didn't hide their disdain upon seeing the 10-year-old girl in her simple patched dress carrying that instrument that looked more like a broken toy. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake," said Maestro Michael Williams, the event organizer, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses as he watched Emily approach the stage. "This is a serious classical piano competition." "There was no mistake, sir," Emily replied with a firm voice, though her heart beat like an offbeat drum. "I signed up 3 months ago. I have the receipt here." She placed the piano on the makeshift table at the center of the stage and pulled a crumpled paper from her dress pocket. The maestro took the document with visible irritation, his eyes quickly scanning the information. "Emily Grace Johnson, 10 years old, Mother," he murmured, shaking his head negatively. "Child, are you sure you want to go through this humiliation? Look around you." Emily looked. The Savannah Historic Theatre was filled with well-dressed people, children accompanied by parents who exuded money and power. Grand pianos shone under the stage lights, while hers looked like a war veteran that had lost important battles. "My grandma always said that music doesn't choose pretty or ugly instruments," said Emily, her small hands caressing the worn keys. "She said music chooses heart." Professor Sarah Thompson, one of the judges, leaned forward in her chair. There was something about that girl's posture that intrigued her. The way she touched the broken piano, even without producing sound, as if each key were a precious treasure. "Let the girl play," she said, interceding for Emily. "After all, it's just 5 minutes." Dr. Richard Anderson, renowned pianist and third judge, let out a sarcastic laugh. "Sarah, for heaven's sake, look at that toy. Some keys don't even exist anymore. How is she going to play Chopin or Mozart with that?" "I'm not going to play Chopin or Mozart," said Emily, interrupting the discussion. "I'm going to play a song my grandma made." The silence that fell over the hall was heavy. Mrs. Elizabeth Parker, the mayor's wife and main sponsor of the event, rose from her front-row armchair. Her diamond earrings swayed as she walked toward the stage, the heels of her expensive shoes echoing like hammer blows on the marble floor. "This is ridiculous," she declared, pointing a gloved finger at Emily. "This event costs $50,000 from public funds. We're not turning it into a circus of horrors." Emily felt tears burning her eyes, but didn't let them fall. Grandma Grace always said tears were for washing the soul, not for showing weakness to those who didn't deserve to see a clean soul. "Please," she whispered, looking directly at Maestro Michael. "Just 5 minutes. If you don't like it, I'll leave and never bother anyone again." There was something in the girl's voice that made the maestro hesitate. Perhaps it was the sincerity, perhaps it was the determination he recognized from somewhere distant in his memory. He looked at the gold watch on his wrist and sighed. 5 minutes, he said, returning to his chair. Not a second more. Emily sat on the high stool someone had placed for her and positioned her fingers over the keys. Some were missing, others were out of tune, but she knew every imperfection of that piano, like she knew the lines of her own hand. Before starting, she closed her eyes and remembered Grandma Grace sitting beside her in the back room of Aunt Rose's house. Grandma's sweet voice echoed in her mind. "Emily, my dear granddaughter, music isn't what comes out of the piano. Music is what comes from the heart and passes through the piano to reach people." When she played the first note, a murmur of disappointment ran through the hall. The sound was out of tune, some keys didn't respond, others sounded muffled. Dr. Richard stood up from his chair with an annoyed expression. "Enough," he said, raising his hand. "This is an offense to classical music and all the great masters who—" "Let her finish," Professor Sarah's firm voice cut him off. "She's barely started." Emily opened her eyes and looked at the professor with gratitude. There was something in that woman's gaze that reminded her of Grandma Grace. The same patience, the same kindness that seemed to see beyond what was on the surface. "Thank you," Emily said softly and began playing again. This time something different happened. Emily had learned to adapt the music to her piano's limitations. Where keys were missing, she created pauses that seemed intentional. Where the sound came out of tune, she used these imperfections to create a unique melody, touching and different from anything ever heard in that hall. The music coming from the broken piano told a story, the story of a grandma who worked her whole life as a housemaid to buy that used piano. The story of a girl who woke up at 5 every morning to practice before going to sell sweets in the town square. A story of love and struggle, of dreams that wouldn't die even when everything seemed lost. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The hall began to grow quiet. The whispered conversations gradually ceased as Emily developed her melody. Even Mrs. Elizabeth, who had sat back down in her armchair, stopped tapping her foot impatiently against the floor. But it was when Emily reached the chorus of Grandma's song that something extraordinary happened. Maestro Michael abruptly rose from his chair, his face pale as if he'd seen a ghost. His hands trembled as he stared intently at Emily and her broken piano. Where did you learn that song?" His voice came out hoarse, almost inaudible. Emily stopped playing and looked at him in surprise. There was something strange about the way he was watching her, as if she were a puzzle he was trying to solve. "My grandma taught me," she replied. "She said she made this song a long time ago, for a boy she taught to play piano." The maestro took a few steps toward the stage, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. The audience was restless, sensing that something important was happening, but not understanding exactly what. "What was your grandmother like?" he asked, his voice still trembling. "Her name was Grace Johnson. She was short, always wore a scarf on her head, and had the gentlest hands in the world." Emily smiled as she spoke of Grandma, her eyes shining with the memory. "She gave piano lessons to poor children in her backyard. She said music was the only language everyone understood, rich or poor." The change in Maestro Michael's face was visible to everyone. He ran his hand through his grey hair and sat down heavily in his chair, as if his legs could no longer support him. "Grace Johnson," he repeated, the name coming out like a prayer. "Miss Gracie." "Did you know my grandma?" Emily asked, stepping down from the stool and approaching the edge of the stage. The maestro took a long time to respond. When he did, his voice was heavy with an emotion he had tried to hide for decades. "I was the boy for whom she composed this music," he confessed, wiping away a tear that insisted on escaping. 50 years ago." The hall erupted in murmurs. Mrs. Elizabeth Parker stood up again, this time with an expression of disbelief, mixed with something that seemed like desperation. "Michael, what are you talking about?" she said, trying to keep her voice low but being heard by everyone. "You told me you learned piano in European conservatories, that your family was from traditional musicians." The maestro looked at her with a mixture of weariness and liberation. "I lied, Elizabeth, to you and to many other people over the years." He stood up and walked to the center of the stage, standing next to Emily. The difference between them was striking. He in his expensive suit and she in her simple dress, but there was something that connected them beyond appearances. "My real name is Joseph Johnson Williams," he began, looking at the audience. "I was born in the same neighborhood where Emily lives today. My mother took in laundry and my father did odd jobs. When I was 8 years old, Miss Gracie found me on the street trying to imitate the sound of a piano I had heard on the radio using old cans." Emily looked at him with wide eyes. Grandma Grace had never told that part of the story. "She took me home and said she would teach me real piano," continued the maestro, now speaking directly to Emily. "Every day, after school, I went to her backyard. She taught me everything she knew, lent me music books, made me believe I could be more than my circumstances allowed." Professor Sarah Thompson was moved, discreetly wiping away tears with a handkerchief. Dr. Richard Anderson remained silent, visibly uncomfortable with the revelation. "When I turned 15, I got a scholarship to study music in the capital," the maestro continued. "Miss Gracie saved money by selling cakes to buy me clothes and a suitcase. On the day I left, she played this music for me. She said that whenever I felt lost, I should remember where I came from and who helped me get where I was." "And did you remember?" asked Emily, her voice small but clear. The silence that followed was painful. The maestro looked at his hands, then at the broken piano, finally at Emily's hopeful eyes. "No," he admitted, the word coming out like a confession. "I forgot. I changed my name, made up a story about my family, pretended my past didn't exist. When I returned to Savannah years later, already famous, I pretended I didn't know the neighborhood where I grew up." Emily felt something breaking inside her chest. It wasn't anger. It was a deep sadness to understand that the person for whom her grandma had sacrificed so much had chosen to deny that love. "My grandma never stopped talking about you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "She said you were her greatest achievement, that even though she didn't know where you were, she was sure you were making music for the whole world." Tears now streamed freely down the maestro's face. Mrs. Elizabeth Parker, realizing the situation was slipping from her control, tried to intervene. "This is very touching," she said with poorly disguised sarcasm, "but it doesn't change the fact that this child is not qualified to participate in this competition. Look at that piano. It's a disgrace." "The disgrace isn't in the piano," said a firm voice from the audience. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was a lady about 70 years old, white hair tied in an elegant bun, dressed simply but with a dignity that radiated natural authority. She stood up and began walking toward the stage. "Who are you?" asked Mrs. Elizabeth Parker, irritated by the interruption. "My name is Margaret Williams," the lady replied, climbing the stage steps. "I'm a retired violinist from the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra and the older sister of Joseph Johnson Williams." The impact of this revelation made Mrs. Elizabeth Parker stagger. Dr. Richard Anderson stood up so abruptly, he knocked over his chair. Professor Sarah Thompson covered her mouth with her hands in shock. "Margaret?" the maestro whispered, as if seeing another ghost. "Hello, brother," she said, tears in her eyes but a smile on her face. "It's been a long time since we've seen each other." What are you doing here?" he stammered. "I heard about the competition and decided to come watch. I didn't expect to find you here, much less denying our origins." Margaret looked at Emily affectionately. "Nor to meet Miss Gracie's little granddaughter." Emily was confused, trying to process everything that was happening. In just a few minutes she had discovered that the competition organizer had been her grandma's student, and now his sister was there, who apparently also knew the family. "Did you know my grandma too?" Emily asked Margaret. "Of course I did, dear." Margaret smiled and knelt to be at Emily's eye level. "Miss Gracie didn't just teach my brother. She taught half the poor children in the neighborhood, including me. She was the one who made me believe that a poor black girl could play violin in a symphony orchestra." The maestro looked at his sister as if she were a mirage. They had lost touch when he changed his name and life, cutting all ties with the past. "Margaret, I can explain," he began. "You don't need to explain anything to me," she interrupted, standing up. "But I think you owe something to this girl and to the memory of the one who taught us that music is about connecting people, not separating them." Mrs. Elizabeth Parker, realizing she was losing control of the situation, decided to act more directly. "This is very touching, but let's get to what matters," she said, clapping her hands to get attention. "This event costs a fortune and has important sponsors. I can't let it turn into a family drama." She signaled to 2 security guards positioned at the sides of the hall. They began moving toward the stage. "I want this child and this circus removed immediately," she ordered. "No," said Margaret, positioning herself between the security guards and Emily. "This child has the right to participate in the competition like any other." "With that ridiculous piano?" Dr. Richard Anderson finally spoke up. "Ma'am, with all due respect, but this is a serious competition. We can't allow—" "Dr. Anderson." Professor Sarah Thompson stood up, interrupting him. "The competition rules don't specify what type of piano should be used. It only says the participant must perform a musical piece on the piano." Dr. Anderson looked at her in surprise. Professor Thompson rarely opposed him publicly. "Sarah, you're being ridiculous. Look at that thing. Half the keys don't work." "And yet she managed to make music," Sarah replied. "Real music. That moved me more than many performances I see out there with very expensive pianos." Emily watched the discussion unfolding around her, feeling small and lost. All she wanted was to play Grandma's music. She hadn't imagined it would cause all this confusion. "May I continue?" she asked quietly, but her voice echoed in the hall because everyone was paying attention to her. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing." "Of course you may, dear," said Margaret, putting her hand on Emily's shoulder. "This is your moment." Emily sat back down on the stool and positioned her hands over the keys. This time she wasn't nervous. She had found people who understood the value of Grandma's music, and that gave her strength. She began to play the same piece, but now with more confidence. The notes flowed more naturally, and she managed to make the broken piano sound almost like a complete instrument. The melody echoed through the hall, touching hearts that perhaps had not allowed themselves to be touched by the simplicity of true music for a long time. But just as she was reaching the most beautiful part of the piece, one of the most important keys jammed completely. Emily tried pressing it several times, but no sound came out. The music was left incomplete with a gap in the melody that broke all harmony. "That's enough of this nonsense," said Dr. Richard, standing up. "The instrument doesn't work. It's impossible to continue." Emily looked at the broken key with sadness. It was the key that represented the most important part of the music, the one Grandma used to call the heart of the melody. Without it, the music lost all meaning. "It's okay," she said softly, starting to rise. "I understand." "Wait," a young voice echoed from the back of the hall. Everyone turned to see a boy of about 12 walking down the central aisle. He wore an impeccable suit and carried a small box in his hands. His visibly wealthy parents followed him with worried expressions. "Ethan, come back here immediately," whispered his mother, but the boy kept walking. Ethan climbed onto the stage and approached Emily. He opened the box he was carrying and revealed several piano keys, some still with price tags. "I bought these keys 3 months ago," he said, looking at Emily with embarrassment. "I knew you were going to enter the competition and—" "How did you know?" asked Emily, confused. "My mother works at the cultural department. She saw your application and told me about the poor girl who was going to participate with a broken piano. I thought it would be fun to watch you be embarrassed." The silence in the hall was deafening. Ethan continued, the words coming out with difficulty. "So I looked for a used parts dealer and bought all the keys your piano was missing. My plan was to wait for you to start playing and then offer the keys at a high price to humiliate you in front of everyone." Emily looked at him, not understanding why he was saying this. "But when you played—" Ethan wiped a tear that ran down his face. "I've never heard anything so beautiful. And when I learned the story of your grandmother and Maestro Michael, I realized that I'm the one who should be ashamed." He offered the box to Emily. "These keys are yours, for free, and I want to apologize for being so mean." Emily took the box carefully, as if it were a treasure. Inside were exactly the keys missing from her piano, including the one that had jammed in the middle of the piece. "Thank you," she said, and there was so much sincerity in her voice that Ethan began to cry for real. "This is absurd," Mrs. Elizabeth intervened again. "Now we're going to allow children to fix instruments in the middle of the competition. Where will this end?" "Wherever the music takes us," said Margaret firmly, "and the music is taking us to a very special place today." Emily looked at the keys in the box, then at her piano, and finally at all the people watching her, some with curiosity, others with impatience, but most with an expectation she could feel in the air. "May I put them in?" she asked Maestro Michael. He looked at her, then at his sister Margaret, and finally at the broken piano that represented everything he had tried to forget about himself. "You may," he said. "I'll help you." Together, Emily and the maestro began fitting the keys into the piano. It was delicate work that required patience and care. As each key was put into place, the instrument was gaining a completeness it hadn't had in years. "Miss Gracie would be proud," the maestro said quietly, just for Emily to hear, as he adjusted the last key. She is proud, Emily replied. I feel her here with us. When they finished, Emily sat down again and tested the new keys. They worked perfectly, creating a harmony the piano hadn't had in a long time. It was still an old instrument marked by time, but now it was complete. Now I can play the whole piece, she said, looking at the audience. But before she could begin, Dr. Richard spoke up again. Even so, this isn't a contest for patched-up pianos. It's a classical music competition. She should play Mozart, Chopin, Beethoven, not these homemade compositions. Richard, Professor Sarah turned to him with a serious expression. Music is music. It doesn't matter who composed it. What matters is if it touches people's hearts. Sarah, you're being sentimental. This is a technical competition. No. A weak but firm voice interrupted the discussion. Everyone looked to see who had spoken. It was a very elderly lady leaning on a cane, who was sitting in the last row of the hall. She stood up with difficulty and began walking slowly toward the stage. "Who are you?" asked Mrs. Elizabeth, annoyed by yet another interruption. The lady continued walking until she reached near the stage. When she spoke, her trembling voice echoed clearly through the hall. "My name is Constance Grace Johnson," she said, looking directly at Emily. "I am Grace Johnson's sister. I am this girl's great-aunt." Emily nearly fell off the stool. She didn't know she had relatives besides Aunt Rose. Grandma had never mentioned a sister. "Aunt Constance?" Emily rushed down from the stage and hugged the elderly lady. "Hello, my little granddaughter," said Constance, stroking Emily's hair. "Your grandma talked so much about you, and this piano. How did you know I was here?" "Your Aunt Rose told me about the competition. I've lived in Atlanta for 50 years, but I couldn't miss the chance to see my sister's granddaughter playing the piano she loved so much." Constance looked around the hall, observing all the elegant people, the expensive instruments, the luxurious decoration. "Gracie always said that one day someone in the family would play in a beautiful place like this," she continued. "She had faith that it would happen." "Dr. Richard," Constance turned to the judge, "you said this is a technical competition, but let an old lady tell you something." She approached Dr. Richard, who watched her with curiosity mixed with impatience. "My sister Grace gave piano lessons to over 200 children throughout her life. She never charged a penny. Some of those children are now famous musicians, teachers, conductors." She looked meaningfully at Michael. "She taught technique, yes, but more importantly, she taught that music is a language of the heart." "Ma'am, that's very beautiful, but—" Dr. Richard began. "I'm not finished," Constance interrupted him with authority. "You want to know about technique? My sister studied classical piano by correspondence for 20 years. She memorized scores she managed to borrow, transcribed music she heard on the radio, created exercises to teach the children. She knew more about classical music than many people who graduate from conservatory." Professor Sarah approached Constance. "You're right," she said. "I knew Miss Grace's work. It was extraordinary." "How did you know my grandma's work?" asked Emily. Sarah smiled and looked at Emily affectionately. "Because I was one of the children she taught," she revealed. 40 years ago. Another revelation that left everyone in shock. Emily looked from one person to another, trying to understand how so many connections were revealing themselves at once. "Professor Sarah, you were Grandma's student?" asked Emily, incredulous. "Yes, I was, for 3 years when I was a child. My family was very poor. We didn't have money for music lessons. Miss Gracie taught me everything I know about piano. And more importantly, she taught me how to teach. Everything I am today as a teacher, I owe to her." Dr. Richard was visibly uncomfortable with the direction things were taking. All these revelations were diminishing his authority as a judge. "This is all very touching," he said sarcastically, "but it doesn't change the fact that this child doesn't have the technical level necessary to—" "Richard," Maestro Michael's voice cut through his speech like a blade. "You want to talk about technical level?" Michael approached Dr. Richard with an expression mixing anger and disappointment. "You studied at the most expensive conservatory in the country, with the best teachers, the best instruments. And do you know what you became? A mediocre pianist who built a career more through arrogance than talent." "Michael!" Dr. Richard stood up, indignant. "No," Michael continued, his voice echoing through the hall. "Miss Gracie taught poor children in a backyard with an old piano, no money for expensive methods, and she formed real musicians, musicians who know that music isn't about showing superiority, it's about touching lives." He pointed at Emily. "This girl, with that broken piano, in 5 minutes of music, moved this hall more than you have in 15 years of career." The silence that followed was tense. Dr. Richard looked at Michael with hatred but couldn't counter the arguments. "I'm leaving," he finally said. "I won't participate in this farce." "Then go," said Margaret. "Music is for those who have ears to hear, not for those who have prejudice to judge." Dr. Richard left the hall stomping his feet, followed by some of the snobbier spectators, but most people remained, curious to see how that extraordinary situation would resolve itself. "Well," said Professor Sarah, "now it's just the two of us judging, me and Maestro Michael, and I would very much like to hear Emily play the complete piece." "Me too," agreed Michael. Mrs. Elizabeth, realizing she was completely losing control, decided to play her final card. "If you continue with this, I'll cancel all the event funding," she threatened, "and I guarantee none of you will work in cultural events in this city again." "Elizabeth," said Michael calmly, "do you really want to make that threat in front of all these people?" "Yes, I do. I have enough influence to destroy any of your careers." Margaret stepped forward. "Mrs. Elizabeth, I don't know if you're aware, but I am the artistic director of the Georgia Arts Foundation, and I can assure you that your influence isn't as great as you imagine." Mrs. Elizabeth paled. She didn't know about Margaret's position and had completely underestimated the situation. "Besides," Margaret continued, "I'm sure the mayor would be very interested to know how you've been using public funds for events that serve more to massage your ego than to promote real culture." "You can't prove anything," said Elizabeth, but her voice trembled. "I can't." Margaret smiled. "Ma'am, I've worked with cultural budgets for 30 years. I recognize overbilling and mismanagement when I see them, and this event has both." Constance, who had observed the entire discussion in silence, approached Mrs. Elizabeth. "Ma'am," she said politely but firmly, "you're turning a beautiful moment into something ugly. Why not let the girl play and then everyone goes their own way?" "Because this is ridiculous," Elizabeth exploded. "This child doesn't belong here. This place is for classy people, not for—" She stopped mid-sentence, realizing she'd gone too far. The hall fell silent, everyone looking at her with expressions of shock and disapproval. "For people like what?" asked Margaret, her voice quiet but dangerous. Mrs. Elizabeth Parker realized she had completely exposed herself. Her mask of refinement had fallen, revealing the prejudice she had always tried to conceal. I didn't mean—" she stammered. "Yes, you did," said Emily, her voice small but clear. "You meant people like me, poor people, black people, people who don't have money for nice clothes." Emily approached Mrs. Parker without fear, looking directly into her eyes. "My grandma always said you recognize people's hearts by the music they make and the music they listen to. You don't like my music because you don't like people like me, but that doesn't make my music worse, it only makes your heart smaller." The hall was absolutely silent. Mrs. Parker looked at Emily with a mixture of anger and something that seemed like shame. "I'm leaving," said Elizabeth finally, "but I won't fund any of this anymore." "I'll fund it," said a voice from the entrance to the hall. Everyone turned to see an elegant man, about 60 years old, walking toward the stage. He wore a simple but well-tailored suit and carried a guitar on his back. "Who are you?" asked Constance. "My name is Charles William Johnson," he said, approaching the stage. "I'm a musician, composer, and cousin of Michael and Margaret." Another revelation. Michael and Margaret looked at him in surprise. "Charles," said Margaret. "Charles William, the boy who played guitar at Aunt Marlene's house." "The same," he smiled, "except now I'm no longer a boy and I don't play at Aunt Marlene's house anymore. I play at the Miami Performing Arts Center." Emily was confused by so many people appearing and connecting. It was as if her participation in the contest had stirred up a network of relationships that had been hidden for decades. "How did you know this was happening here?" she asked. "Margaret called me an hour ago," explained Charles. She told me about the girl who was playing Miss Gracie's music and about the brother who had denied his origins. I cancelled an important rehearsal and rushed here." He looked at Michael with a serious expression. "Michael, you've disappointed me. Deeply. Charles, No." Charles raised his hand. "Miss Gracie didn't just teach you two. She taught me, Jonathan, who is now a conductor in New Orleans, Rosalie, who became a music teacher in Charlotte, Peter, who has a music school in Tampa. We all owe our careers to her." He turned to Emily. "And you, girl, are the granddaughter of the most important woman in our lives. If anyone deserves to play music in this hall, it's you." Charles took the guitar off his back and climbed onto the stage. "How about I accompany you in Miss Gracie's music?" he proposed to Emily. Emily smiled for the first time in all that commotion. The idea of playing accompanied made her less nervous. "I'd love that," she said. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing." Mrs. Parker, realizing she had completely lost control of the situation and was now facing not just a poor girl, but an entire family of respected musicians, decided to leave. "This is ridiculous," she murmured, gathering her purse. "When you want to return to reality, come find me." She left the hall, followed by a few supporters, but the vast majority of people remained. In fact, more people had entered during all the commotion, drawn by the extraordinary events taking place. "There," said Margaret, relieved. "Now we can focus on what really matters, the music." Emily sat back down on the stool, now with her piano complete and functional. Charles positioned himself beside her with his guitar. Maestro Michael remained near the stage, watching. "Are you ready?" asked Charles. "I am," replied Emily, taking a deep breath. She placed her hands on the keys and this time began to play with a confidence she hadn't had before. The piano sounded much better with all the keys working, but most importantly, Emily was playing for people who understood and valued Grandma Grace's music. Charles began to accompany on the guitar, creating a harmony that perfectly complemented the piano melody. He knew the music as well as Emily, and the combination of the two instruments created a rich and moving sound. The music told the story Emily had lived that afternoon. It spoke of overcoming, of people finding each other after years lost, of prejudices being broken, of talents being recognized. But more than that, it spoke of the love of a grandmother who had planted seeds of music in dozens of hearts and now saw those seeds blooming. When they reached the chorus, Margaret approached the stage and began to whistle the melody. Constance, despite her advanced age, clapped in rhythm. Professor Sarah closed her eyes and let herself be carried away by the music, remembering the lessons in Miss Gracie's backyard. Even Maestro Michael, who had spent decades denying that music, began to hum softly the lyrics he thought he had forgotten forever. But the most emotional moment was when Emily reached the final part of the music. In that section, according to what Grandma had taught, the pianist should pause for a few seconds and speak from the heart what she was feeling. It was a tradition Miss Gracie had created, saying that music without feeling was just organized noise. Emily stopped playing and looked at the audience. There were so many things she wanted to say, so many feelings to express. "My grandma always said that music is a bridge between hearts," she began, her voice clear and firm. Today I understood what she meant. Music brought together people who had been lost for years. Music turned enemies into friends. Music showed that it doesn't matter if we are rich or poor, if we have an expensive piano or a broken piano. What matters is the love we put into every note. She looked specifically at Maestro Michael. "Maestro Michael, my grandma never stopped being proud of you. Even when everyone said you had forgotten her, she always said, 'Michael is making music for the whole world. That makes me happy.' She died loving you like a son." Tears streamed freely down the maestro's face. He approached the stage, climbed the steps and knelt beside Emily's stool. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Forgive me for denying who I am. Forgive me for forgetting who taught me to be who I am. Forgive me for letting pride speak louder than gratitude." Emily stopped playing and hugged the maestro. It was a hug that carried Grandma's forgiveness, the forgiveness of all the children he had indirectly abandoned when he abandoned his roots, the forgiveness of himself. Grandma said music is about second chances, Emily said softly just for him to hear. Every time we play a piece of music, we can do better than the last time. Michael pulled away and looked at Emily with a smile mixed with tears. Finish the music, he asked. I want to hear the ending. Emily started playing again, now accompanied not only by Charles on the guitar, but by Margaret whistling, the maestro humming, and several people in the audience who had been moved by the whole story. When the music ended, the silence that followed was different from all the other silences of that afternoon. It was a silence full of emotion, of recognition, of people who had just witnessed something special. The first person to clap was Constance, then Margaret, then Charles. Next, the entire hall erupted in applause that lasted several minutes. But Emily wasn't paying attention to the applause. She was looking at her piano, running her hands over the keys that were now complete, thinking about Grandma and how happy she would be to know that her music had brought together so many people she loved. Emily, Professor Sarah approached the stage. On behalf of the jury, I would like to say that you have won this competition, but I didn't even finish my performance properly, said Emily. There was all that commotion. You not only finished your performance, said Michael, still emotional, you gave us all a lesson in music. You reminded us what music truly means. Margaret approached and handed Emily a golden paper. This is your first-place certificate, she said, and along with it comes a full scholarship to the Music Conservatory in Atlanta. Emily looked at the paper in her hands, then at all the people around her. It was a moment she had dreamed of, but not in the way it had happened. Thank you, she said. But I have a question. What? Asked Sarah. If I study at the conservatory, will you let me teach poor children on weekends, like my grandma used to do? The silence that followed was one of admiration. A 10-year-old girl, who had just won the chance to study at the best music school in the region, was thinking of teaching other children. Emily, said Charles, moved, you not only can but should do that. That's how we honor the memory of those who taught us. More than that, said Margaret, we will help you set up a community music school. All of us as volunteer teachers. Michael stepped forward. And I want to be the first to volunteer. It's time to go back to my roots. Emily smiled, but there was still something worrying her. What if the other children don't have a piano? Mine is actually borrowed. It's from Aunt Rose. We can solve that, said a voice from the audience. Everyone turned to see Ethan approaching the stage. The boy who had tried to humiliate Emily now looked at her with admiration. My parents have a musical instrument store, he explained. I can get used pianos, guitars, flutes, everything needed for the community school. Why would you do that? Asked Emily. Ethan blushed but answered sincerely. Because you taught me that music isn't about having the most expensive instrument, it's about having your heart in the right place. Emily stepped down from the stage and hugged Ethan. It was a hug that symbolized forgiveness, friendship, and the possibility of different people coming together through music. There's one more thing, said Constance, approaching with her cane. Emily, your grandma left something for you. I was keeping it until you were older, but I think today is the right day. She pulled an old, worn-out notebook from her bag. This is your grandma's music notebook, explained Constance. It has over 100 compositions she made throughout her life, all dedicated to the children she taught. Emily took the notebook with reverence. It was like holding a treasure. Opening it, she saw page after page of handwritten music, with loving dedications to different students. Look at page 53, said Constance. Emily flipped through until she found the page. There was a piece of music she had never seen before, with a dedication that made her cry, "For my granddaughter Emily, who will take our music to places I never imagined, with all the love from Grandma Gracie." How did she know I was going to participate in this competition? Asked Emily through tears. Your grandma didn't know about the competition, explained Constance. But she knew you had a special gift. She always said you would play for many people one day. Emily looked around the hall. The Savannah Historic Theatre was full of people who had been touched by her and Grandma's story. People who had learned about music, about forgiveness, about second chances. Professor Sarah, said Emily, may I ask something? Of course, dear. May I play one more song, one that's in this notebook? Sarah smiled. You can play as many songs as you want. This is your day. Emily returned to the piano and opened the notebook to the page that Aunt Constance had pointed out. The music was beautiful but complex, more difficult than anything she had ever played. It's very hard, she said, studying the score. Your grandma wouldn't write anything you couldn't play, said Michael, approaching. Can I help you understand the music? Together, Emily and Michael studied the score. He explained the more complicated tempos, the more complex harmonies, but always respecting the way Emily interpreted the music. Now play, he said when they finished studying. Emily began to play the new music. It was more elaborate than the first, requiring more technique, more expressiveness, but every note seemed to have been written specifically for her. It was as if Grandma knew exactly how Emily would play the piano 10 years later. The music spoke of growth, of a girl who started small but would go far. It spoke of responsibility, of using the musical gift to help other people. It spoke of family, of people who love each other even when they are far apart. When Emily finished playing, the hall was completely silent. It wasn't a silence of waiting. It was a silence of people who had just heard something transformative. Emily, said Margaret, her voice emotional, that music is one of the most beautiful I've ever heard. My grandma was very talented, said Emily with pride. Talented and wise, added Charles. She wrote this music knowing exactly who you would become. Professor Sarah approached the stage with a smile on her face. Emily, I have a proposal to make, she said. How about, in addition to the scholarship at the conservatory, you also become our youngest teaching assistant? Teaching assistant. That's right. You could help teach other children, especially those who come from situations similar to yours. You understand these children in a way that we adults sometimes can't understand. Emily looked at her piano, then at Grandma's music notebook, finally at all the people watching her with affection and expectation. I accept, she said, but only if you promise me one thing. What? Several asked at the same time. That we will never forget that music is for everyone. Rich, poor, child, adult, those who have an expensive piano, those who have a broken piano. Music belongs to those who have the heart to feel. The hall erupted in applause again, but this time Emily paid attention. She looked at each person who was clapping and saw emotional faces, shining eyes, sincere smiles. Grandma, she whispered, looking at the theatre ceiling, you were right. Music really is a bridge between hearts. Months passed after that memorable day. Emily began her studies at the conservatory, but kept her promise to teach underprivileged children on weekends. The community school was inaugurated in the same neighborhood where she lived, in a building provided by the city. Maestro Michael Williams went back to using his real name and became the volunteer director of the community school. He organized regular performances where the children could show their progress to the community. Margaret moved from Atlanta to Savannah to be closer to the reunited family. She became the educational coordinator of the school and brought innovative methods of music teaching. Charles William visited the school every week, giving guitar and composition workshops. He was working on an album of Miss Gracie's songs, adapted for different instruments. Professor Sarah Thompson continued at the conservatory, but began dedicating half of her time to the community school. She developed an exchange program between the conservatory students and those at the school, promoting social integration through music. Ethan became the first wealthy student at the community school. His parents, initially reluctant, ended up supporting the project when they saw how the experience was positively transforming their son's behavior. Aunt Rose, who had been worried about all the changes in Emily's life, ended up becoming the administrative coordinator of the school. She discovered she had a knack for organization and loved being surrounded by music and children. Constance, despite her advanced age, visited the school whenever she could. She became a sort of grandmother to all the children, telling stories about Miss Gracie and the importance of music in people's lives. As for Mrs. Elizabeth Parker, she tried to sabotage the community school project for some time, but ended up losing political influence when her questionable practices came to light. Eventually, she moved to another city. Dr. Richard Anderson was never seen again in Savannah. Rumors said he was giving private lessons in a small town in the countryside, but no one confirmed the information. Emily grew a lot in a few months, not only musically but as a person. She learned to balance her studies at the conservatory with her work at the community school, always remembering Grandma's teachings about music and life. Grandma's piano, now completely restored, occupied a place of honor in the community school. Emily made sure that all the children could play it, saying that a piano with so much love history should be shared. One afternoon, exactly 1 year after the competition, Emily was at the community school teaching an 8-year-old girl named Mary Grace. The girl was very much like Emily had been, shy, poor, but with impressive natural talent. "Teacher Emily," said Mary Grace, "I'll never be able to play properly. My hand is too small." Emily smiled and remembered when she had said the same thing to Grandma Grace. "You know what my grandma used to tell me when I said that?" asked Emily, sitting next to the girl on the piano bench. "What?" "She said it's not the size of the hand that makes the music beautiful. It's the size of the heart. And you have a huge heart, Mary." The girl smiled and went back to trying to play the song Emily was teaching. It was the same song Emily had played in the competition, Grandma Grace's song. "Teacher," said Mary after managing to play the complete melody, "when I grow up, I want to be like you." Emily felt a strong emotion taking over her chest. It was the same emotion she felt when she thought about Grandma and how she had influenced so many lives. "Mary," she said, stroking the girl's hair, "you don't need to be like me. You need to be like you, just in the best way possible. Music will help you discover who you really are." At that moment, Maestro Michael entered the room where they were. "Emily, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked. Emily left Mary practicing and approached the maestro. "What is it, Maestro Michael?" "I have some news for you," he said, barely able to hide his excitement. "The New York City Conservatory wants you to perform at the Young Talents Festival. It's the most important musical event in the country for pianists your age." Emily was surprised. It was an incredible opportunity, but also a frightening one. "I don't know if I'm ready for something so big," she said. "Emily," Michael placed his hand on her shoulder, "a year ago, you played in a local competition with a broken piano and transformed the lives of everyone who was there. You're more than ready. But what about the school and the children I teach? The school will still be here. The children will keep learning. You're not abandoning anything. You're just going to grow and show the whole world what you've already shown us. That true music comes from the heart." Emily looked out the school window and saw several children playing in the yard. Some were from the local community, others came from more distant neighborhoods, and some were children from wealthy families who had discovered the value of inclusive music education. "All right," she finally said, "I'll go, but on one condition." "What?" "I want to take Mary Grace with me, so she can see that girls like us can also play in the best places." Michael smiled. That answer was exactly what he expected to hear from a student of Miss Gracie. "Of course," he said. "And how about we take your grandmother's piano too?" Emily broke into a huge smile. Grandma would love to travel to New York City. And so it was. 2 weeks later, Emily was on stage at Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, playing Grandma Grace's piano for an audience of over 2,000 people. Mary Grace was in the front row alongside Aunt Rose, Margaret, Charles, Professor Sarah, and Maestro Michael. The piece Emily chose to play was the same one from the competition, the music that Grandma had composed for the boy Michael so many years ago. But this time she added her own introduction, a tribute to all the children studying at the community school. When she finished playing, the ovation was even greater than the previous years. But Emily wasn't paying attention to the applause. She was looking at Mary Grace, who was watching her with eyes shining with admiration and hope. After the performance, a journalist approached Emily for an interview. "Emily, you're considered one of the country's greatest young musical talents. What's your secret?" he asked. Emily thought for a moment before answering. "I have no secret," she said. "I just have a grandma who taught me that music is about connecting people, not about being better than others." "And what are your plans for the future?" "To keep studying, keep teaching, and keep playing my grandma's music for anyone who wants to listen. Because music that stays locked away isn't music, It's just silent noise. The journalist laughed at the answer. Silent noise? It's something my grandma used to say, explained Emily. She said that music that isn't shared is like a noise nobody can hear. It's useless. Years passed. Emily became a nationally recognized pianist, but never stopped being a teacher at the Savannah Community School. The school grew and became a benchmark for inclusive music education, receiving visits from educators worldwide. Mary Grace, inspired by Emily, became a violinist and now teaches at the same school where she learned. Ethan became a music industry entrepreneur, but always focused on social projects. Maestro Michael wrote a book about his experience, titled Back to Roots: How a Girl and a Broken Piano Taught Me the True Meaning of Music. The book became a bestseller, and all proceeds were donated to community music schools. Margaret founded a network of community music schools throughout the state of Georgia, always based on the Savannah school model. Charles William released 3 albums with Miss Gracie's compositions, all with great critical and public success. He donated all royalties to a fund that financed musical instruments for underprivileged children. Professor Sarah Thompson became the dean of the conservatory, always maintaining the philosophy that music is for everyone, regardless of social background. Grandma Grace's piano remains at the community school, played daily by dozens of children. A plaque beside it reads, "This piano belongs to all children who dream of making music." It was donated with love by Grace Johnson, who believed music is the universal language of the heart. Emily, now 20 years old, a beautiful and talented young woman, continues living in Savannah. She could live in any major city in the world, perform in any famous theater, but chose to stay close to her roots. On a sunny afternoon, she was at the community school preparing a special performance. It was the school's 10th anniversary, and they were going to hold a concert with all the children who had passed through over the years. Professor Emily, a 9-year-old girl named Hope, approached her. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, Hope." "Why did you never move to a big city? Everyone says you're famous and could live anywhere." Emily smiled and looked around the school. There were children practicing piano, guitar, flute, violin. There was laughter, music, life. "Hope," she said, "do you know what the most beautiful place in the world is?" "No." "It's the place where you can make a difference in people's lives. And for me, that place is here." The girl smiled and returned to her violin. Emily watched all the children, thinking of Grandma Grace and how proud she would be to see that her music had multiplied into so many other songs. That evening, during the school's anniversary concert, Emily did something she hadn't done in a long time. She performed a solo, just her and Grandma's piano, the original piece she had played 10 years earlier in the competition. But this time, the music sounded different, more mature, more complex, richer in emotions. Emily had grown up, but Grandma's music had grown with her. When she finished playing, she stood up and looked at the audience. There were hundreds of people there. Former students of the school, parents, teachers, officials, famous musicians who came to pay tribute to the project. 10 years ago, she began, I was a girl with a broken piano and a dream. Today, I'm a woman with a working piano and a certainty. Music is about transforming lives. She pointed to the children on stage with her. These children are the future of music, not because they will be famous, but because they will bring music where it is most needed, to people's hearts. The applause was long and emotional, but the most special moment was when all the school's children joined on stage and played Grandma Grace's music together. Hundreds of voices and instruments united in perfect harmony. Emily closed her eyes and listened. It was as if she could hear Grandma's voice mixed with all those other voices, saying she was proud, that everything had been worth it, that the music had found its way. When she opened her eyes, she saw tears on almost every face in the audience. They weren't tears of sadness, but of joy, emotion, recognition that they were witnessing something special. At the end of the performance, Emily approached Grandma's piano and ran her hand over the keys she knew so well. "Thank you, Grandma," she whispered, "for teaching me that music isn't about being the best. It's about being the one who makes a difference." And then, for the first time in many years, Emily felt as if she could hear Grandma Grace's voice softly answering in her ear, You're welcome, my granddaughter. Keep playing, keep teaching. Keep making music with your heart. Emily smiled, carefully closed the piano and joined the children and teachers for the celebration. Music had fulfilled its role once again. It had brought people together, created bonds, and transformed lives. And as the celebration continued around her, Emily thought about the future. There were still many children to teach, many songs to play, many lives to touch through music. Grandma Grace's piano had started out broken, but now it was complete, just like Emily's life, just like the lives of all the people who had been touched by music over those 10 years. End of story. Now tell me what you thought of this story. Do you believe Emily made the right decisions? How do you think Grandma Grace would feel seeing everything that happened? Leave your opinion in the comments, that's very important to us. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one.